Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome Ted, Jill, Shira, and Brett from the delegation. So you've been in Australia for a couple of days. I want to start off by, I want to know a little bit more about what you see on the news or what you see coming out of Australia in the United States, and what were your desired impressions of, before you travelled here to when you got here. You've been here for a couple of days now, so the scene's been set. You've avoided the marches on Sunday by taking a beautiful tour of the Great Ocean Road, which was serendipitous. But in terms of what you're seeing coming out of, what the Australian Jewish community has been facing in the United States, what are you seeing there, and how is that informing your trip here?
Joel, thanks, and thanks everyone for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for the very warm welcome. It's a really interesting question, and I would actually zoom out a bit. Our community, and I trust that this is true for the community here as it is around the world. If I asked you where you get your information, my guess is you spend as much time on all of the Israel news sites and your WhatsApp groups, and you follow all the same people on social media. And when you do that, it's the bad news that always gets highlighted. And it's true everywhere I go. People ask me what it's like in the United States right now for Jews because the protests are so awful. And we can talk about that, but the same thing is true as it relates to Australia. The perception from America is that these protests are taking place and they're massive in scope, and the combination of the protests and some of the decisions made by the government suggests that this is not just a really challenging time, but a place that is difficult for Jews. Difficult. It's a difficult moment. It's a tough place to live as Jews. And one of the reasons that we thought it was so important to come visit was because we also understand that there is a community here, an important and large and thriving community that has contributed enormously to Australian society, and that we suspected that the story was never as simple as it appears on social media. So we had those concerns, and we've come, and sure enough, the opportunity to not just deepen the relationship that we have with AIJAC and knowing the great work that you do, but having a chance to get out into the community both reaffirms that there are real challenges, but also highlights the incredible commitment that the Australian Jewish community makes in the face of these challenges to standing strong and proud and fighting back.
And I think that was clearly on display. So this morning we've already started off with two meetings, and we went to the Adass Israel Synagogue, and we went for a tour there and saw what was inside. But then on the other side, we heard from great Orge's leadership, who was also at the coalface of what we're experiencing with this explosion of anti-Semitism, and it really does encapsulate that point that there is a negative story there, but there's a lot of fight and there's a lot of will to pursue a great and fruitful life here.
Yeah, it's there's nothing more. For me anyway. There's nothing more inspiring than spending time with Jewish students, Jewish university students in particular. At AJC, our campus global board has some of the most inspirational student leaders from around the world, including in Australia, and to spend time with August and hear their stories. Yes, of the challenges that they're facing, but in all the ways that they recognize that what they're doing on their campuses, what they're doing in their university settings right now, is not just about helping to keep the Jewish community safe today, but it's very much about the future for them, for Australian Jewry, for global Jewry. Very, very uplifting, and I encourage, and probably some of them are your kids and grandkids, and you should feel great about that. But a really inspiring group, and a reminder that even with the darkness that we saw on full display at the synagogue this morning, where I don't think, and I was talking to the board member, Izzy, that who showed us around, there's so much news happening so fast that sometimes you remember that there was a horrific attack against the synagogue. And in this case, now it's been brought to the fore again because the Iranians were identified as the party behind it. But I don't think, in my case anyway, that I understood the severity of the attack. And so it was a really important visit there. We wanted to show our support for the community. And then to follow that up with these young people was a really great juxtaposition.
And look, we all know and we're all aware that the issues that we're experiencing with anti-Semitism in Australia is a global problem. And, whilst recognising that AIJAC has such a huge reach globally, offices Latin America, Israel, Europe, obviously North America as well. And with us here in Australia, you hear the stories, you see how anti-Semitism is more globalized than ever. So leveraging off both your congressional experience as you set up the bipartisan task force for combating anti-Semitism while you're in Congress, and now leading an organization with such a global reach like AIJAC, what tools are proving effective and where are we falling short?
First, it is vitally important to always emphasize the importance of truth, the ability to speak with clarity, with moral clarity about what's actually happening. Everything else flows from that, and it's true with the facts. I mean, for anyone who's been to Israel since October 7th, and if you've had the opportunity to go to the crossings, to see the trucks going in to Gaza, the situation in Gaza is challenging. The fact that virtually no stories anymore even mention the fact that all of this continues because Hamas still holds 48 hostages because of what happened on October 7th. It's as if they're no longer an actor in what's happening there. That suddenly Israel just decided that it was in its interest to send troops in and have 900 IDF soldiers killed in action on its own. So reminding people exactly what happened is critically important, speaking with clarity about that, but then also looking at what we're seeing and pointing out the dangers of the kinds of things that are being said and done. We've been saying since October 7th, October 8th, those first protests, which we all remember, right after October 7th, the ones that we saw in the United States and around the world, but the ones in New York that we saw where the protesters took to the streets, they weren't protesting anything that Israel had done because the IDF hadn't sent a single soldier into Gaza yet to defend the people of Israel and the Jewish people. They were out there supporting Hamas. And right from the start, we knew that if people allowed that to become the narrative, then it was ultimately going to impact the Jewish community negatively and severely. And nobody wants to be right about this, but we said right at the beginning that as long as people are allowed to say freely, allowed to scream about genocide and make claims about genocide and call Israelis baby killers and Zionist baby killers, and by calling Zionist baby killers, you're calling Jews baby killers. And when you allow anti-Zionism to become a socially acceptable form of anti-Semitism, and when you talk about globalizing the Intifada, it's only a matter of time until that leads to real violence. And we've seen it everywhere. In the United States and AIJAC, we saw this firsthand. We had an event in Washington, D.C. back in May, and 2 young people were murdered outside of an AIJAC event at the Jewish Museum by someone who was coming to kill Zionists. Just as we did soon thereafter in Colorado, where someone set fire to Jews, killing one and injuring more than a dozen others, again, wanting to end Zionists. This is the most important thing that we stress to policymakers, that they have to speak with clarity, they have to call out anti-Semitism, and finally, Joel, they have to be willing to acknowledge it wherever it comes from. So if you are in the United States, if you're a Democrat, you have to be able to call out anti-Semitism within the Democratic Party. It is not enough to point to extremists on the right. Likewise, Republicans have to acknowledge the same thing. And we see that here. And yesterday or at the Sunday at the protest, when you had neo-Nazis on the right and you had these pro-Hamas marchers on the left, the fact that I saw an interview the next day where they were trying to explain, well, one type of these protesters were really dangerous and the other was really just mostly families. And then the other side was saying, well, one side was really just opposing immigration and the other side hates Jews. Policymakers have to understand, the people that we interact with have to understand that if you're not seeing anti-Semitism wherever it comes from, then you're not seeing it at all. And we can't win unless you do.
So that moral clarity is essential in governments, and obviously here in Australia, it's a little bit devoid of. But in the United States, and something that I came to realize when I was there earlier in the year at the AIJAC Global Forum, is that President Trump signed an executive order to combat, most importantly, global anti-Semitism. So executive branches of the US government are empowered by that executive order to care and to look at issues that are facing not just Jews in the United States in terms of anti-Semitism, but globally, including in Australia. So how important do you think that executive order is? And do you think that institutions of the executive branch of the US government can actually have a positive impact in assisting global Jewish communities like here in Australia?
Well, I absolutely do. In the last administration, the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Deborah Lipstadt, was somebody that we worked closely with on a whole host of areas. She traveled extensively, making sure that people understood that the fight against anti-Semitism matters to the U.S. Now, with President Trump, you also have this executive order, and you have a president who's made clear that this is a priority. When a visiting dignitary hears from the executive branch that fighting anti-Semitism is not just in the best interest of the Jewish community and in the best interest of your country, but also matters to the United States, and when it's a relationship like the US-Australian relationship, which also is critically important, then that's going to make sure that the issue is elevated and gets the attention that it deserves.
So let's take that a little bit further. So we spoke about that executive order to combat global anti-Semitism, but obviously, and Colin and myself and other AIJAC colleagues have been talking about the impact that the Australian government's positions are having on the bilateral relationship with the United States. So just a comment or two on certain policy directions that this government or our government in Australia will make vis-a-vis Israel. How are they being perceived within this administration? And on something like recognition coming up in the next couple of weeks in the General Assembly, we've seen moves by Secretary Rubio to block Mahmoud Abbas and his delegation from coming. Do you see any other moves by the Trump administration to countries like Australia, Canada, the UK and France in terms of their pursuit of unilateral recognition?
Well, the fact that the president is, shall we say, never unwilling to speak out, I think is the way we can put it. Look, President Trump is going to say what's on his mind, and in this case, the president has centered the fight against anti-Semitism in a way that matters in the United States and the battle against anti-Semitism, especially on college campuses, but also matters in this context. So, yeah, the announcement, the French, I know the steps that were taken by the administration with respect to France when France first announced that they were going to do this program at the UN with the Saudis, and then that got shelved because of the war with Iran. And Macron announced he's going to designate a Palestinian state without really any conditions, and then you have Starmer and Carney and Albanese now chiming in with announcements of recognition, subject to conditions. Each of them has different conditions. All of them know these conditions aren't going to be satisfied before the UN General Assembly, and all of them understand that diplomatically you can't achieve the outcome they say that they want by simply declaring it, as if negotiations don't have to take place in order to achieve them. And the administration has made that point, and I think is going to continue to make that point leading up to the UN General Assembly. And I suspect at not just leading up to, but during UNGA week, during the UN General Assembly week, this is something that U.S. diplomats, point that U.S. diplomats will be making on an ongoing basis. Again, because if the goal here, this gets back to what we were just talking about before. If the goal is to achieve peace in the region, and that can't happen until Hamas lays down its weapons, until Hamas, as we heard, until it's clear that Hamas can play no role in the future of Gaza. Something that was, I guess, part of the Prime Minister's, one of the Prime Minister's conditions. None of that happens if world leaders just declare that there's going to be a Palestinian state, and that's the point.
But I'll add that none of that happens without the assistance of the United States. So both on ending the war and ultimately if there is a global coalition in recognizing and pursuing a legitimate and secure two-state solution, maybe not now, but in the future, there has to be a realization by leaders, including here in Australia, that they cannot be done without the assistance or the cooperation of the United States.
Right, of course, and it requires, I think, it requires an even broader perspective. At AJC, we have offices in Jerusalem and in Abu Dhabi, which we opened right after. We've been going to the Gulf since around 1990. Right after the Abraham Accords, we opened an office in the Gulf in Abu Dhabi, first full-time office by a Jewish organization in the Arab world. We spend a lot of time thinking about what's going to come next. That's what our Center for New Middle East focuses on. And so a key part of that is Israel and Saudi Arabia normalizing relations. Well, the Saudis aren't going to normalize relations until there are certain assurances that they're getting. Israel has to be involved, obviously, but the United States has to be involved there. And to think that the prime ministers of Australia and Canada and the UK can somehow, with whatever conditions they try to impose, circumvent the important role that the US has to play, it's just not a serious way to get to the outcome that they claim they want to achieve.
So there's a great segue, because it's on my list of questions, and that's the Abraham Accords. So you've touched on that. Because of the Abraham Accords, AJC has an office in Abu Dhabi. So just three quick fire points. The first is that where do you see the Accords expanding? We've obviously seen huge economic booms, tourism booms, and great bilateral relationships. But where's the untapped area of those Accords, and where can we expand? And finally, what do you perceive the effect of the war in Gaza has on the expansion of those Accords?
Those are just three yes or no questions.
Just quick fire.
Quick fire. Okay, in terms of expansion, we could talk about different countries and how they approach Israel, but Saudi Arabia is the key. And if Saudi Arabia, which is the most important country in the Muslim world and the most important country in the Arab world and the most important country in the Gulf, if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, then suddenly, if you have the most important Muslim country, then Indonesia, a country where we do a lot of great work, and Shira Lowenberg, who is the head of our Asia Pacific Institute, does such great work, then that's a place where there might be an opportunity. If Saudi joins, then other Gulf countries might join. If Saudi joins, then the broader Arab world suddenly there sees that it's possible to do that as well. So that's the key. In terms of the opportunities that we have, there are still so many economic opportunities that exist. And right now, the relationship with between the UAE and Israel it's been strong throughout, even since October 7th, but there are enormous opportunities to do more there. And then other countries, Bahrain is a country where so much more can be done. And obviously, those economic opportunities, when more countries join, will be significant. As was explained to us when we were in Saudi Arabia, the opportunity to view the region not as a series of bilateral relationships between different countries and Israel and any other country, but as one unified region, that's where the huge opportunity is. Ultimately, there has to be a focus on the day after in Gaza. Everyone's focused on that, including AJC. But we also have to be thinking about longer term. In the near term, the Gulf countries, the Emiratis in particular, are in a position, and have said as much, and in that declaration made clear that there can't be, the Arab League made clear that there can't be Hamas in Gaza. And when it's clear that Hamas won't be in Gaza, then the rest of the region is prepared to start investing in rebuilding Gaza. And when that starts to happen, then it becomes easier to envision the future. And we didn't even talk about, I'll just mention, we didn't talk about the rest of the world. I mean, the opportunities, we've spent a lot of time working on the India-Middle East Economic Corridor and what it would mean for India to be able to connect through the entire region, through Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then into Europe, and what it would mean for the European countries that could be on the receiving end of that. It will be a transformative event, but we need to actually get through this moment first.
And that's a very important point. And as you know, because of our partnership, not just with AJC, but with API, with Shira, we've had a long history of cooperation in Asia, in India, but most importantly with Colin's efforts over many decades in Indonesia. So we are very we have positive feelings about what the future will look like with the expansion of those accords, and we hope that regionally Indonesia is one of those countries that will hopefully normalize very soon.
Yeah, can I just, it's important, Joel, just to spend a moment and thinking about and acknowledging, because it says a lot about the Jewish community. The fact that AIJAC, that the Australian Jewish community has devoted the kind of time and resources that you have and that Colin has, investing in developing these relationships in Indonesia, and that we at AJC are contributing in our ways from the other side of the world. Tiny population, but understanding where an opportunity lies that will benefit, in this case, not only Israel and Israel's place in the region, but ultimately the region as a whole, and contributing to peace in such a significant way. Just an opportunity to, I think, give us all ourselves a pat on the back.
And I would wholeheartedly agree, because working together has been very, very productive, not just for our respective organisations, but for the communities that we represent. And I have no doubt that will continue in earnest in the future. I've got two quick questions before opening up to Q&A. So one both for domestically in the United States, and one more broadly globally. So specifically, it's more about, the topic of today was challenges and opportunities. So we've just spoken about the opportunities, now I want to speak about the challenges. So looking specifically to American Jewry, in the context of a post-war environment, where do you see the trajectory of the Jewish community there? And I'll sort of give you subcategories. Are we concerned about the younger demographics? Are they moving away from Israel and the Jewish community? Are they coming back closer? What are the real challenges that you see domestically in terms of the Jewish community in the United States?
It's not to avoid the question, but it is literally both. Do we have concerns? Sure. Part of the concern is, if I if I may, we're rightly spending an enormous amount of time fighting anti-Semitism because the challenges are real and we have to confront it. But if all we're doing is fighting the anti-Semites, if the only thing we're doing is talking about what we're fighting against, and we're not spending enough time talking about what we're fighting for, and that for means who we are as a Jewish people and what we've contributed in every community that we've lived in throughout the history of our people, and what the state of Israel means, not just to us as Jews, but what the state of Israel means to the world. The fact that because of the successes that Israel's had geostrategically, the future of the Middle East, I know it's challenging to think in these terms now, but the future of the Middle East is actually so much brighter given what Israel's managed to do to Hamas and to Hezbollah and to Iran, that Syria and Lebanon are now actually potential countries to normalize relations with Israel. That's all of these things have to be a part of what we're teaching young people, not just having them engage in the battle for the battle's sake. That said, there are so many people, and I know this is true in Australia as well, there are so many people who, because of what happened on October 7th, this is true for population as a whole, but for young people especially, who for the first time really understand the fact that what happens in Israel and what happens to the global Jewish community are not separate, that we're inextricably linked. And so many of them, like those students we met today, so many of them have stood up and said, I'm going to find ways to get involved. I'm going to find ways to help shape the future for me. And in so doing, I have a role to determine what the future of the global Jewish community looks like. And that's an amazing, amazing thing to see. So yeah, I have real concerns about some, but I think that there's plenty to work with there. But I'm especially excited about the students and young people who give us such hope for the future.
So we do see that in Australia, a massive pull factor in being comforted by being closer in the tent here in Australia. So you do see that in the United States, and you see that as a big positive
Absolutely.
going forward.
Yeah.
So more globally, and I've already stated the global reach of AIJAC. You hear it now, you couldn't be further away from home. We're a very successful and very proud community here, very Zionist community, and we've had some struggles. But globally speaking, in terms of the challenges that you have domestically in the United States, in terms of global advocacy, where do you think we're lacking and where do you think we need more work?
The Australian Jewish community?
Just generally, the global.
I've been here for a couple of days. I'm not going to tell you that.
You can tell us that by the end of the week.
That's actually I think it's a really interesting and important question. I know I referenced it before, but at AJC, we spend a fair amount of time working, as I know AIJAC does, in the social media space. Both what we put out there, what we work with others to get out there. We put a lot of content out to help university presidents and content to help policymakers and trying to set the record straight and make sure that people understand the facts. But even with all of that, there is this sometimes failure to realize that what people, and maybe it's not the same here, but in the United States anyway, and I know in other places, the amount of time that people spend looking for terrible news about the Jewish community, which you can find. It is not hard to find terrible news, but constantly looking for the terrible news, and sometimes too often, I would maintain, looking past the positive stories, both the people who are doing the right thing, saying the right thing, standing up for our community, those inside and especially outside of our community who are willing to stand up and stand with us. It's really important for us to be able to do that as well, because it makes us, I firmly believe it makes us better and more impactful when we do our work, when we talk to our friends, our neighbors, our elected officials, when we come in with our chests stuck out, and we're very proud, and we're aware that we're not alone, and we're aware that only by standing together are we helping not just the Jewish community, but the community as a whole. That's, I think, something that we should really spend more time devoting ourselves to accomplishing. And when we do, we're more impactful. And frankly, we feel better doing the work and seeing the positive outcomes as well.
I think that's a very key point. One of the symptoms of being under siege like we are here is that we have an information war where we're trying very hard to put a number of resources to clean up the misinformation and get out accurate information. But what that means is that we lose time in telling our stories. And our stories are impactful, and it is a way of bringing in a more broader coalition to get behind us. Thanks, Ted, for the introductory remarks, and we'll open it up to questions in the audience.
Thank you for that. Let me make this observation. I'll talk about what it means more broadly, because this is something we also spend a lot of time doing, right? We spend a lot of time in the U.S. thinking about and responding to outrageous comments made by Jewish Voices for Peace, which, by the way, is the most fringe organization. It's not a Jewish organization. It represents the fact that they call themselves Jewish Voices somehow seeks to validate their position as a Jewish organization, which is unfair. They don't deserve that kind of credit. Likewise, and they're linked, because I made the mistake of spending some time recently on social media digging into this. The Jews for Mamdani effort, there's a lot of overlap there too. Are there young Jews who are going to vote for Mamdani because he's charismatic and an exciting political figure, and just as they would for other charismatic political figures who are running against two candidates that are from a different generation and have all of their own challenges? Sure, but I hesitate. Well, we'll find out in the election how big that Jewish, but it's not a majority by any means of the Jewish community. Most in the Jewish community have the same concerns that I think you have in asking the question, which is you have in a candidate someone who couldn't bring himself to condemn the use of the language globalize the Intifada. This is something that we've spent a lot of time talking about, the fact that every other group in America, as I'm sure is the case in Australia, every group gets to define for themselves how they hear language, what it means to their community, the threat that their community faces because of it. The Jewish community, not so much. If we tell you that globalize the Intifada doesn't mean that we should attack Jews, as was the case during the first and second Intifadas, and what that meant to the Jewish civilians who were blown up all across Israel, then we have the ability to tell you that. This was essentially the position of Mamdani in multiple interviews, that other people can have different opinions of this. That's I think something that we need to focus on. The questions that I think he's going to get as we head into the campaign, because in America, nobody really focuses on campaigns until September. It's questions about what happens if we see the kind of encampments that prevent Jewish kids from walking across campus. Again, will you call the police to clear those out? Or will you support the use of the police to call those out? And when he says that Israel has a right to exist like any other country, but refuses to acknowledge that Israel is a Jewish state, then the hope is the follow-up question the next time will be, are you suggesting that the only state in the world that has no right to exist as it defines itself is the one Jewish state? There are a whole series of questions that have to come out before we get to the election. I think that we'll see much more attention paid to the specifics of his record and how that would impact the Jewish community. But if ultimately his views continue to be completely contrary to the interests of the broader Jewish community, then I think going forward, then that's just something that the community is going to have to decide how to confront, how to deal with, and how to make sure that that when he says he's going to do everything he can to protect the Jewish community, that he comes to understand how language ties into the Jewish community that he's trying to protect. Joel, go ahead. Yeah. It's your home court. You go first.
There was something that really frightened me in terms of the West's response to the 12-day war with Iran. Clearly, what Iran had been pursuing for decades, not just its nuclear program, but the export of terrorism, that greatly impacted, obviously regionally in the Middle East, but also in countries in the West, including our own. It was greatly concerning to me, the reaction to the war and the fact that it was a war. There seemed to me from the population itself and also certain Western governments, that we are in a post-war environment where wars are not necessary and all wars should be condemned regardless of what that war may be. A lot of those people also predicted these very inaccurate but grandiose World War III doomsday situations that never materialized. So in terms of the projection of Western weakness in the acceptance that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes war is inevitable, that was a great concern of mine, which sort of recognized that indeed we are in a different phase of that Western civilization.
I think just picking up on the Iran issue, because I do think it speaks to your question. It's the inability sometimes to connect the dots. The decision that the Prime Minister made to kick the Iranians out here was really significant. And likewise, the decision that the E3 have made, that the French and Germans and Brits have made about snapback sanctions on Iran because of Iran's nuclear program, also very significant. The failure to then connect that to the fact that Iran, throughout its history since the revolution, has made its top priority the destruction of Israel, ultimately the destruction of the United States, the massacre of Jews, supporting terrorists all around the world. Failing to connect those dots is the challenge. To your point, the Emiratis, others in the region who are closer to this, I think have an easier time making those connections because they've been on the receiving end of this as well. I don't know in terms of where this all goes and Trump and Bibi. I think it requires a broader focus again that it's the challenges in the Middle East are really significant. And at the center of it, and this is the last thing on this, what's so frustrating, at the center of it has been Iran and its support for terrorism. And I would remind all of the people who turn out for these rallies here and around the world, the Iranians who are also busy abusing their own people. They violate the human rights of their own people. They abduct, they take people hostage. They abduct people on a regular basis. They are repressive with respect to women. All of the things that so many of the people who show up at these parades saying matter so much to them, at the heart of what's happening in this global struggle is a country whose positions are completely the opposite of what the people who carry that big poster of the Supreme Leader a couple weeks ago actually represent. I think it's, for me anyway, it feels a little premature to talk about that plan. There's been some reporting on what that looks like. There was a slide deck that made its way around on social media that may or may not have been accurate. I am frankly reserving judgment there. I know that the slide that you might have seen that has the beautiful apartment buildings and casinos. I don't know that there's reason to believe that that is just not an accurate description of what happened at that meeting. And until we hear from the people who were there, I'm not going to comment on whether it can survive another administration when it's not even clear it's going to go forward with this one.
But just on that, but do you think that the Trump administration currently is wanting to be heavily involved in the day after of Gaza? Is that at least evident from the discussions coming out of the administration? They don't want to just leave it to Israel to finish the job and then move out. They want to have some type of hands-on involvement in the reconstruction or the democratization of Gaza.
I do. I mean, the administration absolutely understands that you can't rebuild Gaza with Hamas there, and also understands the leadership role that it plays in the region. And so I don't anticipate them just washing their hands of this. But there is obviously there's a great distance between washing their hands of this, saying you take care of it, and American control with the construction of lots of American built buildings. I think we have to wait and see how it comes out. But no, I don't think that they're just going to walk away.
Fair enough. I've got one more question. Yes.
The country that has the most influence over Hamas is Qatar. The Hamas leaders throughout have lived very comfortably in Doha. And when the war is over, it just seems to me that one of the first things that Qatar needs to do is to make sure that Hamas no longer is welcome in Doha or anywhere else in Qatar. I think that's an important step. I think the Qataris, for all of the conversations about Qatari money, I think there has to be an acknowledgement by the Qataris who claim that routinely claim that they're not spending money in the United States or anywhere else around the world for nefarious purposes. Well, there should be a willingness on their part to actually have an accounting to show that if that's not the case, that if those accusations are wrong, then there should be an effort to prove that. And we know that Qatar has played this role where they talk to everyone in the region. That's the way they've always viewed it. And the largest U.S. base in the region happens to be in Doha, and all of that is important. But fundamentally, we're now 700 days, more or less, into a war where Hamas terrorists are continuing to hold hostages, and the country with the most significant ability to influence them hasn't done it. And so I just think going forward, there has to be a different approach taken with the Qataris, starting with the things that Qatar itself has said about what's transpired over this period. And going forward, if they want to be a constructive force, then we've got to see that from them.
First up, you've done a great job. Thank you so much for being here, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause for Ted.
Thanks, everyone.